Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So in this week's video, I wanted to talk about how to begin practicing a new piece. And I think it's really important to talk about how to go about practicing. I remember that when I was younger, my teacher never really told me how to practice. She would just send me home with a piece and say, practice this. She might say, practice slowly, practice hands alone, practice with a metronome. But she never really talked how to go about practicing. And I think this is a really, really important concept because I like to think that every single note we play on the keyboard uses some kind of technique. And so we always have to look at a piece and think, okay, what technique am I using here? And eventually, of course, that becomes instinctive and doesn't require as much thought. But in the beginning, it requires a lot more conscious thought. And so I wanted to kind of go over a piece of music. But before we do that, I wanted to talk about the three basic kinds of techniques that we use when you play the keyboard. So the first one is the most basic, simple technique, and that is what we're going to call up-down gesture. And that's just simply if I have my hand above the keyboard and my arm, hand, and finger all go down together to play a key. All right? Or if I play multiple keys, I go up and down on each note. Now, this is obviously a technique that's really important. We use all the time. If I'm playing chords, etc., it's a really important technique, but it's the most basic kind. Okay, now the second technique that we use when we play the keyboard is circular gesture or circular technique. And that is used when we have notes going in opposite directions, changing directions, I should say. So something like an arpeggiated passage, where we change direction, or for instance, if we have a broken chord pattern, or something like this, etc. Now the third technique we use is rotation technique or gesture. And that is when it's this basic, and you're probably familiar with it, it's the turning of the arm like so, used in trills, or broken intervals or broken octaves. All right, now, rotation, I believe, is a more common kind of gesture or technique that's taught. But all three of these together, they're the three basic main kinds of techniques we use. And all other techniques are kind of a combination of those, which brings me to the second point before we get into this piece, is that most of the time, music is not, of course, that simple. We're going to combine multiple techniques when we play a certain passage. For instance, if I played something like this, it's going to require multiple of those techniques, not just one of them. Now, if we look at that, we can see that that involves circular gesture, up and down gesture, circular gesture, up and down, circular, circular, that changes to rotation at the end. Now, when we combine those three different techniques together, that passage becomes really smooth and easy and really simple. Okay, so sometimes we have to combine multiple techniques. So when we look at a piece of music, we want to be thinking, what techniques am I going to use to play this particular passage? And we're going to look at a specific piece now. We're going to look at New Shoes by Linda Nemeth. And this is from the preparatory B level from the Celebration series of the Royal Conservatory. And so we're going to look at this piece now. All right, so I'm just going to play the first line. Okay, so let's take a look at the right hand first. So you'll notice that the right hand has these intervals with rests in between them, and each one of the intervals have staccato dots under them. So by definition, we can see that that's a perfect place to use our up-down gesture Now, I like to tell my students that anytime we have an interval, we have to make sure that we go down into the keys with our hand, our arm, and our fingers all together. Okay? Now, you might notice that as I'm playing this, I'm starting from closer to the surface of the keys and going up, 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 up. However, if I have a student who maybe hasn't experienced what it feels like to release their weight into the keys, I'll tell them to start from above the keys, like so. And that helps them kind of get the feeling of releasing weight into the keys and then lifting in sort of almost a bouncing motion, like so. And the right hand pretty much uses that same gesture the whole time, even though the chords change. It's the same basic idea. Now, if we look at the left hand, in the left hand we have the melody, and we have a slur that goes almost over the whole first line, and then the same thing on the second line. So if we notice, we have notes going in opposite directions. So we have a note that's low, and then it leaps high, and then it leaps back down to a low note, high note, leaping up and down. So when I say notes going in the opposite directions, I'm thinking lower on the keyboard, higher on the keyboard, etc. So this is the perfect place to use a forearm gesture. Because of those larger intervals, the rotation helps transfer the weight or shift the weight from finger to finger. Now, we also want to combine some up-down motion into this left-hand passage, specifically with the first note of the slur and the last note of the slur. So we think of the first note and the last note being the larger up-down motion. So I go down into the keys, I stay in contact with the keys, and then after this note I lift. Okay, so it's not just like a down, up sort of thing, but it's sort of stretched over a longer period of time with the forearm motion or rotation in between. And the reason why I like to do that is, again, students oftentimes will have a hard time feeling that weight drop into the keys if they start from the surface of the keys. So I like to tell them to start from above the keys. All right, now sometimes if we start from above the keys, it can kind of make that first note sound accented, which we don't want, being the first note of a slur. And so a good way to get around that is to tell them to start a little bit closer to the keyboard and tell them to release weight into the keys rather than using words like drop. Now, I find that most of the time when a note is accented, it's because students are pushing into the keyboard. So that's something to address to make sure the students are not pushing into the keyboard, but just letting their weight drop freely into the keys. Now we'll notice that it's the same thing in the left hand almost throughout. Now, but there is one section that I do want to talk about, and that is measure 8, or the pickup in the left hand to measure 9. So previously in the piece, the fifth finger is going to be on C, and here it's going to have to change to 4 on C. So most of the time when I teach this piece, what I notice is that what students do is when they're coming to that place, so a few measures before, then what they want to do is they want to finger substitute thumb to 2 to hold the note, because oftentimes students obsess about holding notes for the perfect rhythmic value, and then they want to move the fourth finger over here. But what happens is there's a lot of movement and reaching around the fingers, okay? So I like to tell my students that our fingers move really well up and down, right? That's really free and easy, but they don't move side to side very well, okay? So your index fingers can, but the rest of the fingers don't very well. So we don't want to try to move the fingers around like that too much. So what we want to do here, come right up to this place. When we get to that F, we're just going to lift, and that's the perfect opportunity to switch to the fourth finger, right? Just go up and down, and just this barely shift over as I go up. Bam, right there. Then the second benefit to this is that allows me to have a little bit of a down motion into the first key, right? So again, it's that up-down motion, okay? So I always like to tell my students, you drop on the first note of the slur and you lift on the last note. Again, all of these techniques are just attempting to get the student to transfer their weight into the key and shift it from finger to finger. So it's important to note that all of these techniques are in service to that weight transfer. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is on the very last line, measures 14 to the end, there are accents on every single note. So what I like to tell my students is that if they want to get more sound, because I don't want them to push into the keys, to just play from a little bit higher on the keyboard. So for instance, instead of going, notice that I'm staying very close to the keys there. What I want them to do is go from a little bit higher on the keyboard, them give a little bit more weight, have a little bit more energy, transfer into the keys just through gravity and momentum from the hand falling from a higher position. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the video. Thank you so much for watching. So I hope that's really helpful. I know that these techniques have transformed my playing, and I hope that they can transform your playing as well. So make sure and put a comment down below and tell me what you think of the video, and I'll see you guys next time.